famous ice cream parlor called the Iceberg, and that's where the iconic photograph of Dr. King holding a V for victory, that was where he heard that the Civil Rights Act had passed in the Senate
Really?
in 1964.
Or you heard it here.
Mm-hmm. And then there's, in fact, there's a photo of it, right?
Oh, there it is, yeah.
And then there is also a doctored photo of that, which we do not exhibit. I have it on my computer. So this is courtesy of Dr. Gordon's family. Dr. Gordon died, unfortunately, early, but when he built this office, he thought he was a dentist and he was going to have his offices down here, and then he would recruit a doctor who would have offices in that part. And you can tell by the color coordination, the two-tone green here, and then the yellow and black in there, which was to be which. And he didn't live long enough to get a doctor in there. So he was replaced as a dentist by Dr. Robert Haling, who had just graduated from Harry Medical College. And Dr. Haling had grown up in Tallahassee. His father was a longtime teacher at what's now Florida A&M University, the leading black college in the state. And in those days, there was not a dental school in Florida. What they did was, if you were white, they would give you a scholarship to go to Emory University Dental School in Atlanta, and if you were black, they would give you a scholarship to go to Harry Medical College in Nashville. But the terms of that were that afterwards, you had to spend 5 years in a medically underserved area of Florida, and that was the definition of this. And Dr. Haling said when he got out of Meharry, then he took a trip all the way around Florida, all down the East Coast, down to Key West, back up, out to Panama City and Pensacola and back through Tallahassee. And he had two places in mind. I think one was Panama City and one was St. Augustine, and how might history have been different if he had gone to Panama City instead. But he came here and it was the right time. He had been in school in Nashville during the Nashville sit-in movement, which gave us John Lewis, and who is now ill, and C.T. Vivian, who just had a stroke and was 95 years old, and Diane Nash, who we were Freedom Night. Anyhow, so he came here, and he was asked to be the advisor to the NAACP Youth Council, and he was just the right person for that. And so they started demonstrations. This picture up here on the wall is members of the Youth Council having a sit-in at the local Woolworth's lunch counter, which was down on the plaza right next to the Episcopal Church there. And they were arrested. And the reaction of officials here to the civil rights movement was, crush it! There was no question at all. And they would never have a biracial committee because they knew that the favorite tactic of communists was to negotiate it. So you didn't talk to these people. So these people were arrested, and one of the terms for letting them get out of jail here was that they had to sign an agreement that they would not take part in any civil rights demonstrations until they turned 21. And I mean, some of these people are 14 and 15 years old. So some of them were scared into signing, but 4 of them told their parents, don't sign that, and they came to be known as the St. Augustine Four, and it became a cause célèbre. Martin Luther King protested their arrest. Jackie Robinson wrote a newspaper column about it, the New York Times and Miami Herald.
So they stayed in jail?
Oh yeah, for 6 months, until the New York World's Fair, when Florida was getting ready to open the Florida Pavilion. There were threats to picket them if they still kept these young teenagers in jail in Florida, so they called a special meeting of the governor and cabinet, and they released them in January of 1964. And they proudly talk about how they immediately went back out to take part in demonstrations. And Jackie Robinson was so impressed that when he came down here that summer, he had a fellow go and find the St. Augustine Four, and he invited the 2 young women, Audrey-Nell and Joanne, to go back to Connecticut and spend a week at the Robinson House there for R&R after their ordeal in jail. And they can still remember Jackie Robinson taking them to the New York World's Fair.
Jim and I went to the World's Fair in New York in '64 on our senior trip.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, so you know.
Yeah.
And that would be right about the age that they were when they went there too. So here you can see in the picture the seats from Woolworths. And if you look behind here,
Oh.
you will see one of
Is
those
that one of
seats
them?
there. Yeah,
I mean, Watertown, they were too, right?
Yeah. And then I started going to beauty school at '64, and we used to go to Woolworths and get our Sundays on Fridays after the end of the week
Standard and all over, store out the same.
in Watertown, New York.
Yeah.
Where it started, right? Is that true?
Yeah, that's the first Woolworths was in Watertown, New York, yeah.
Yes, I read that in
Yeah.
Wikipedia.
When you were looking up where we were.
Yeah, that's where we are from.
Mary worked in
I
Wow.
worked at the
the
candy.
candy counter.
God.
Oh, that was my favorite.
You used to have to pop a balloon to tell how much you had to pay for it.
Yeah.
I went and had the last breakfast they served at the local Woolworths.
Oh, really?
Historic breakfast. So I think there are many precious exhibits here, but my favorite of all, and it's been on display in the state capitol in Tallahassee, are these 2 pages from the Tyson family Bible. Mrs. Tyson lives across the street. I was just talking to her. She's 96 years old and still working. And she is one of the legendary house mothers of the civil rights movement because, of course, all the hotels and motels here were segregated.
Right.
People who came down to support civil rights were not welcome. So many of them stayed at her house, and she asked them to sign the family Bible. So there's like a who's who of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King, Ralph David Abernathy, Isaiah Williams, Fred Shuttlesworth. These were all of the old lions of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference from all over the South who took part in most of the notable battles of the civil rights movement. So I just love that Mrs. Tyson has generously allowed us to have that
Did she run a boarding house? Is that what?
No, but there was a boarding house next door to it, and you'll see behind, did you all see the movie The Green Book?
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Well, actually, Don Shirley, the musician there,
Yeah.
his
Yes.
father was the minister of the Black Episcopal Church here after World War II, so the Shirley family lived in St. Augustine. But the Green Book was like an AAA guide for black travelers, so they
Yes.
didn't get either in trouble, threatened, or in jail, or whatever. And so there were two places in St. Augustine, one of which just burned a few weeks ago. And the other of which is one door over from Mrs. Tyson's house here, the Kelly Colored Tourist Home. And the man who owns the house now donated this to Accord. And, some people have seen this sign and say, that is the most incredible thing to still have.
Yeah.
Because although I can remember all the, white and colored signs and stuff, they have done a tremendous vanishing act to the point where they make replicas of them now and sell them on eBay. Don't ever buy one thinking it's an original. They fake, they have them on cardboard and they fake age it with flame and stuff.
Right, if I saw this today, I would think it'd be colorful rooms. People buy a house fixed.
This, of course, is Dr. Haling. Dr. Haling passed away in 2014, just before Christmas, 2015. And this was on display at the memorial service for him here in St. Augustine.
Handsome man.
He was
He's a wonderful man.
of all the people that I have met, he is the absolute top. And his practice here, of course, was destroyed after the civil rights. I mean, his house was shot up, the family dog was killed. Mrs. Haling narrowly escaped because she was pregnant and had run into the bathroom, but she had still been sitting there on the couch. The bullets would have gone through her. And people were afraid people said, I'm afraid to go to him as a dentist because I might get bombed when I'm in the dental chair. So he left here eventually and moved down to the Cape Canaveral area, which was then having a boom with the space race, and then the space race collapsed and he moved down to Fort Lauderdale where he spent the rest of his life. But in the 21st century, he was the most hated man in St. Augustine. The great quote from public officials here was, "We'll negotiate with anybody except Martin Luther King or Robert B. Hailing." You can't talk to those people. So, but in the 21st century, he became the most honored citizen in St. Augustine's history. And it started, the first activity of Accord was to get the street where his home had been shot up renamed for him in 2003. And then as we go around, I can show you some of the later awards that he got. And some of these are citations. The last major thing, he was put in the Florida Civil Rights Hall of Fame, which is you go in the state capitol, and if you want to visit the governor, you turn this way, and the Florida Civil Rights Hall of Fame is right there on the wall. And he was inducted with James Weldon Johnson and A. Philip Randall, so that was the strongest group of inductees they ever had. And he was honored by the American Dental Association. A group of us went down to Orlando, and there was a picture and a story about him in the American Dental Association magazine. You know, I don't think that he cared so much about the honors. And my favorite picture of him was taken right behind this building of him sitting in his Toyota. He said, kids come to me and they say, "You're a dentist, why don't you drive a Lexus or a Mercedes?" I said, "Well, I have other priorities." And he's sitting there with the typical Dr. Hailing smile, and he has a huge paper bag, because he always traveled with a paper bag full of material about the civil rights movement. And you couldn't get away without him giving you a bibliography of 20 books you might want to read to follow up on it. And after he passed away, Mrs. Duncan gave me one of his paper bags, and I keep that in a treasured place at home now. So let us move around.
David, if I can
Yeah.
just interject, there's a donation by Ted too in here.
Of course.
Yes.
Right. I recognize the old kinds of tape here. Historic newsreel, compliments of civil rights reporter Ted Mascott, Boston, Massachusetts.
Really?
Yes.
We are honored.
It's right there, right, Dad? Let's take a look here.
That's what we use.
He's not.
I brought that to Glenn. The last time, not the last time, but my first return to St. Augustine after March of 1964 was 50 years later.
Well, this room is a tribute to Dr. Gordon and his wife, the late Rosalie Gordon Mills. I gave the eulogy at her funeral when she passed away at the age of 97 in 2004. And she made history in 1965 by becoming the first black woman in 400 years to seek public office in St. Augustine. And she was not elected. She ran for the city commission, and she also ran for the school board. And there has in fact never been a black woman elected to public office in St. Augustine. And at this moment, we have an all-white city commission, all-white school board, all-white county commission, all-white fire department as far as I know, and we had an all-white police department until a couple of years ago. So, you know, this is St. Augustine in the 21st century. Mrs. Mills was always the most interesting person in a room. And you see her here with somebody who didn't get elected president of the United States and members of the family. And she had gone to college in Boston in the 1920s and knew all kinds of people. County Cullen, the famous poet, she said they used to double date with Dr. Percy Julian, the famous black scientist and millionaire. So she always had interesting stories to tell whenever I would be in a group and I would see her there. I would just hone in on them.
Doctor who, tell me, just remind me again that she was the wife
Of Dr. Gordon,
doctor
who built
who-
this
yeah.
building,
Yeah.
but didn't live to see it be filled up. So when Dr. Hailing had this office then, And when people started to be arrested in the civil rights demonstrations, all the lawyers in St. Augustine were white, and none of them would handle civil rights cases. So they had to go to Daytona or to Jacksonville to get a black lawyer. And it's interesting because the main one was Earl Johnson, who later became the first black president of the Jacksonville City Council. And then there was Joseph Hatchett, who became the first black federal judge in the South. And then there was Leander Shaw, who became the first black Chief Justice of the Florida Supreme Court. So they had pretty good legal aid. But still, there was too much, and there were things going on in those cities where they had their own practice. So they put out an appeal in 1964 to lawyers around the country and said, give us your summer vacation. Come here to St. Augustine for a week or two, and we'll have an office for you. And that was here because they had gotten a doctor in here. So this is where the lawyers came, and they would have the cases all stacked up, you know, and they'd do their work for a week. And we had a couple of these lawyers to come back. Both of them have since passed on, but one was Al Bronstein. And he said, you know, I came down here just to spend a week or two, and I wound up spending the next 5 years as the head of the Lawyers Constitutional Defense Committee in the South. And I got Martin Luther King out of jail in Mississippi when his life was threatened and all that. So it really made a difference. And the other thing that happened was everybody's heard of Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, but there's also a letter from the St. Augustine jail. This is the only place in Florida where he was arrested. And he wrote a letter to an old friend of his, Rabbi Cy Dresner in New Jersey, who had worked with him on civil rights campaigns before. And he said, I know you're about to go to a meeting of the Central Conference of American Rabbis in Atlantic City, and I want you to urge the rabbis to come to St. Augustine and take part in our movement. So the largest mass arrest of rabbis in American history took place here in St. Augustine on the bayfront at the old Monson Motel, which has been torn down. And Rabbi Dresner is still alive, and he came back here.
met him.
Okay.
Met him 3 years ago when I was with Clement King in Boston.
Okay,
Yeah.
yes.
Wow.
I mean,
He's
he's a
full of
character.
energy and
my favorite story that he told when he was here, he said he had gone down to southwest Georgia. Albany, Georgia was a big civil rights campaign that Dr. King was involved in 1962. And Rabbi Dresner went down, he said, and we would go around to all these rural churches and Dr. King would speak. And you know, if you get a good line, you don't just use it once, you use it over. And so he sat through all of these. And Dr. King had this riff, you know, where he would go, and it was, you know, let freedom ring, you know, let freedom ring. Well, so Rabbi Dresner thought that was pretty good. And when he got back to New Jersey, they wanted him to speak, and he would go around and let freedom ring. Well, come August 28th, 1963, and the March on Washington, you know, King says, let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain in Tennessee, from, you know, Stone Mountain in Georgia and stuff. And one of the New Jersey newspapers ran a headline that said, King quotes local rabbi. The most famous athlete to come out of St. Augustine was Willie Gallimore, who is in the College Football Hall of Fame. He grew up in St. Augustine. He played college football at Florida A&M in Tallahassee, and then he played professionally for the Chicago Bears. And he came down here, his last visit to St. Augustine was to take part in the civil rights movement. And this is a door from the Ponce de Leon Motor Lodge. That's where Mrs. Peabody was arrested. And we have just been donated this door from someone who salvaged it when the Ponce Lodge was torn. St. Augustine was very anxious to make these places disappear. So the Monson was demolished in 2003, and then they immediately focused on the Ponce de Leon Motor Lodge, which my father always said was the nicest place in town. And they said, it's blighted. So 2004, starting exactly on the 75th birthday of Dr. King, they began the demolition of the Ponce de Leon Motor Lodge. Anyhow, Willie Gallimore had been the first black person who could register as a guest there when he came down to support the civil rights movement. A few weeks later, he was killed in a car crash during training camp. It was page 1 news in the New York Times, and page 13 news in the St. Augustine Record.
Can I ask you a question? This reminded me of what you just said. You said that to this day, there has not been a black councilman or school board member. What do you attribute that to?
No,
Is
there's
it lack of?
not been a black woman.
Oh,
Black
woman, I missed you saying.
And there
I
have
was
been a
like
few
saying-
black elected officials.
Okay.
But,
Not many, right?
Not very
Would
many,
it
and
be-
only one in the 21st century. And when there was in the 1990s was the high point for that century. We had 2 black city commissioners, a black school board member, and a black county commissioner. And so they changed the voting system. So instead of voting by districts, you voted at large. So
Okay.
whereas you could have a district with a significant number of
Yeah,
black
yeah.
voters, when you went at large,
You
know,
didn't.
the black
Exactly.
column
So it was the white power structure, more demographics,
They just
more.
take this as
yeah.
kind of a natural,
Yeah.
the other thing that was quite naturally, if any black person holds an office, we should send them to jail. So I remember when they paid a white lawyer $50,000 to dig up dirt on the black county commissioner, and he couldn't find anything, you know, but it was a very ugly
But in this day and age,
situation.
you know, the 21st century, you would think that that had, I mean, you can see them doing that in the 50s and 60s, you know, gerrymandering and stuff, but.
Not today.
you
Well,
know,
Andy
it's-
Young has a theory. He says, look, in Birmingham, you know, the demonstrations ended because we negotiated with the businessmen and the powers that be, and they decided they weren't. He said, in St. Augustine, they wouldn't even talk to us. The reason the demonstrations ended was that the Civil Rights Act passed. Well, that passed somewhere else. And for a long time here, they never, you know, white people were just bitter. And I took a job, I came down here in 1977, and in 1978, I took a job doing a survey of all the old buildings in town. And this was a state job and had connection. The first thing I was told was, you must never mention the name of Martin Luther King in St. Augustine. And so this was the attitude, and this was, you know, a
That's the
PhD who told me
70s, right?
this, and a
Late
dozen
70s.
more years afterwards, you
This
know.
is
And that
2020,
continued,
you know, you
so.
would think.
Well, it's like 50
Generational
years kind of
changes.
made a difference. After
Yes.
50 years, the city started to do things that had civil rights in the name, but
And now
not
it's
through a
big.
court. They don't approve of us.
They don't approve of us. Oh, that's too bad.
Anyhow, so this is where the lawyers would have been at the time, and a lot of the strategy meetings were held here. We have newsreel footage of Dr. King sitting in a couch up against that wall there with that window.
Not a very big room.
No, you wouldn't have a mass meeting for that, they had the churches. And so one of the churches was right across the street, and another was around the corner. And then there, within about a 2-3 block radius, there are 2 other churches. Back when Dr. King first spoke here, so many people wanted to hear him that no church was large enough. So they held rallies simultaneously at 2 churches down there that were around the corner, and shuttled Dr. King out the back door of one and in the back door of the other, so that everybody would have a chance. People recognize this probably. They had in 2005, the post office issued a series of stamps honoring the civil rights movement. So we had a local ceremony here, and we did up these for people who had been active in the civil rights movement. There's a picture of Dr. King holding a press conference right behind this building in front of the old Duncan House. Here's C.T. Vivian, who recently is 95 and recently had a stroke, but he's won the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Here's James Brock, the motel manager, pouring acid in the swimming pool. And so we,
Is he the guy that got beaten up with tailings and they went to a Ku Klux Klan?
No.
No,
these
that's
were all
somebody else.
local people who got beat up here. But so that was nice. I wish we had more of these. I think they're collector's items now. Then in here is, you can see there's a spot on the floor here where we didn't cover it with carpet. This is where,
You can go in.
the dental chair was.
I can get it.
Somebody came in and said, I remember seeing Dr. King in that dental chair getting worked on. So we left the spot there so you can see where it stood.
It's their document.
And one of the other great
Civil rights.
artifacts of the civil rights movement here is this freedom hat of Mrs. Catherine Twine. She came to be known as the Rosa Parks of Florida because she went to jail early and often in the cause of civil rights. And this was in the summertime, and the jail couldn't hold all these people, so they had a big chain link enclosure behind the jail. No trees, hot summer sun, and they would put people out there, dozens, 100, and people would start to faint. And so Mrs. Twine said, well, I'm gonna have my own shade. And she bought this, broad-brimmed hat and wrote on it, "Freedom Now," the slogan of the movement, and there's a button on top from the March on Washington in 1963. And every time she thought she might get arrested, she would wear her freedom hat. And in later years, school groups would come by her house and she'd bring out the freedom hat and show them. And I remember then the young students would go back and draw pictures of Mrs. Twine and her freedom hat. And they had them on display in the county courthouse and in one of the local banks. And this is a copy of a telegram that Dr. King sent to Mrs. Peabody after her arrest. Her arrest here, which was on the front page of the New York Times on April Fool's Day 1964, was really the event that let the world know that something was going on in St. Augustine. So Mrs. Peabody is still revered here. And both the two daughters of Mrs. Burgess and the youngest and last surviving son of Mrs. Peabody have been here. Mrs. Burgess was the wife of the pioneer black Episcopal bishop, and she came down. There were 4 prominent Boston women. 3 of them were the wives of Episcopal bishops, and the 4th was the wife of the vice president of John Hancock Insurance Company.
That's the wife of the governor.
They came down from Boston.
To kind of shine a light.
Mother of the governor,
Yes.
that's what it was there, yeah.
This is, and that was an article that appeared
Oh,
on
yeah.
Life magazine, maybe, about Mrs. Peabody. So, we have been fortunate. The city has never done anything to support Accord. In fact, it was kind of hilarious because every time we would have an event, they would have a conflicting event right at the same time. And, so what money they have put up has never gone here. But Northrop Grumman Corporation, which is our largest employer in town, has been very good over the past decade and more in supporting us. And they have paid for all of the Freedom Trail markers. You see some copies of them. There are over 30 Freedom Trail markers on historic sites because we got tired of hearing people say, no historic significance. We said, well, if you put a historic marker in front of them, at least they'll have to say something else. So, and one of the projects is we have one last slave cabin in St. Augustine, except it's a subject of great controversy among white historians and archaeologists. To them, it's anything but, oh, it was an orange juice factory, or, whatever, Black City Commissioner Earl Jones said, where do they think we lived? But it was in danger of falling in, and Northrop Grumman paid to shore it up. And,
Where is this, right here in
so
St.
we'll drive
Augustine?
by it.
You'll take it by there. You'll take it by there.
Down on the south end of Lincolnville. So this was an award, this is the second highest award the city has, the De Avoles Award. And we nominated Mrs. Twine for the highest city award, but the city manager, whenever a black person was nominated for that, would immediately knock them down to the second award and then give the top award to a white person, usually one who would oppose the civil rights movement. So we were not able to get the top award for Mrs. Twine, and in fact, it was not until 2013 that for the first time the city gave its top award to black person.
Turn that light on in there.
Oh, yes, that one is, that's now an apartment.
Here's Mrs.
The
Peabody.
record signs up for almost 100 years. It's now part of Gannett. That's Andy Young.
Here's L.O. Davis.
In fact, this is the memorial for Dr. Hanlon. You see that picture? It's out on the body. And Andy Young came down and
And of course, it was on the front page, and it wasn't quite on the front page of